Hello, everyone. We're going to start our second session, and I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everybody. I am Amber Reintz. I am a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner at Avera Behavioral Health in Sioux Falls. I'm also a clinical program manager at Avera, just supporting different pieces of our clinical care. And then I also support our navigation team. So our goals today is to talk a little bit more about the current mental health crisis in America. I don't think it's a secret to anybody, but I also am a believer that when we talk about asking people to change behavior, we have to make sure that we understand the why, and the crisis is certainly part of the why. We also want to talk today about what self-care is, and then we'll talk about why it's important, discuss some different ways to maybe consider taking care of yourself, and then lastly, talk about trying to find some balance in our life. So to get started, again, I don't think it's a shock to anybody. Our world is very complex. New research reveals that Americans between 45 and 65 years old are experiencing more stress today than they did in the 1990s. Again, not a shock probably to any of you. The American Psychiatric Association recently released a statement that said, "We are facing a national mental health crisis that could yield serious health and social consequences for years to come." Again, this certainly isn't a secret, but it also feels like sometimes we continue this narrative that mental health is getting worse. And I would challenge each of us to look at what can we do about it, certainly for people within our communities, within our homes. But then today I really want to challenge you, what can you do to help to take care of your own mental health? So let's start first just with why are people more stressed? One area would certainly challenge that we are now more connected than we ever were before. I think about even myself when I was growing up. I used to be able to go to a basketball game and come home and there would be a message on the answer machine if somebody was trying to get a hold of me. When you think about it now, you can be enjoying a basketball game and you can also be getting multiple texts, multiple Facebook messages, multiple phone calls from people who really do expect that you should be able to answer your phone all of the time. We are now more connected to our work than ever before. And this certainly does help in some ways, right? We can answer emails any time of the day. Because of WebExes and Zooms, we can now be available even on our quote days off. While this certainly allows us to be able to maybe be more efficient in the work that we do, how does it affect us? How does it affect our own mental health? We are now more connected to social media than ever before. When you look at research regarding social media, is something positive coming from social media? Yeah, there is something positive, and that is that we are able to connect with people. But there's also a lot of negative. We see that with social media, there's certainly more comparisons than ever before. It used to be that you would maybe go to your family holiday over Christmas and you would leave and you would say, "Hey, that was a great holiday, we had fun." And now you come home and you see pictures of everybody in matching pajamas and, oh, why didn't we do that? And you maybe see that somebody else posted, again, their family looked to be having more fun than maybe what we did. Again, how does that begin to affect even something that we experience joy in, but then sometimes begin to question later? With that, there is an increase in comparisons. And I often use the example that when I think about my mom growing up, okay, every year she would create a Valentine's box with me. And every year I would go to a school with my Valentine's box. And in my opinion, it was a good box. In her opinion, it was a great box. And she never knew the difference, right? Because she never knew what the other parents created. Now, because of social media and Pinterest and all that we see online, the amount of stress that people put into things like Valentine's boxes is getting out of control, right? And that's just one small example. Again, it's the same thing when we compare Christmas, when we compare what we did over the summer, right? We're comparing ourselves now more than ever. And with that, it certainly creates more stress in our life. We're also seeing a change in relationships and family dynamics. When you think about sometimes how people maybe were able to personally support people 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it's very different than now. Somebody was recently talking about within the field of psychology that in today's world, everything is done with such intensity. Where before your kid would maybe play basketball during basketball season, now your kid plays basketball year round or they're going to be behind. Your child maybe enjoyed dance, and now in order to be able to do dance, you got to be willing to do it year round and travel throughout the country. Are those things great? Yeah, they are. But do they come with stress? Absolutely. Another challenge when it comes to us being more stressed is poor and infrequent stress-related mechanisms. So sometimes when I talk about self-care, I'll ask people, what do you do for self-care? And they'll say things like, oh, I go to Starbucks every week, or I go out with my friends once a week for a drink. Just think about that, right? The things that we're saying that we're doing to take care of ourselves sometimes are actually not even necessarily good for us. We also see a lot of infrequent times that people are practicing self-care. So sometimes when I ask that open question of what do you do for self-care, sometimes people will say, well, annually I go for a hunting trip. Or once a year, my sisters and I get together and we go shopping in the cities. Just think about that if you compared physical health to mental health. So when I go to my family doctor this year, if my family doctor says to me, hey, Amber, what are your health goals? And I'll say, well, I'm really going to focus on my physical health this year. And if she said, okay, how are you going to do that? If I responded, well, one day in the next 365 days, I'm going to exercise, what would she say to me? It sounds absolutely ridiculous, right? Like you think that that is going to maintain or improve your physical health because you're going to take one day out of the year and take care of your health? It's ridiculous. But yet, how many times do we do that with mental health, right? That once a year fishing trip is going to sustain my mental health throughout the year? That's pretty unrealistic. The other thing I think about a year ago or so, I went to a space in town here and I had a massage done. Okay, and at that time, they have a really good marketing team. So about every month now, I get a text message, okay? And the text message always says, hey, Amber, it is time for your massage. And I always kind of laugh to myself like, yeah, no kidding. It's definitely time for one, but I don't have time this week. Or maybe financially, I don't want to put my finances into that this week. And that's sometimes what happens is when we do this so infrequently, then when as other barriers get in the way, we're not able to actually do the things that we say we do to take care of ourselves. Another reason that certainly we are more stressed is when you think about the COVID-19 pandemic. And I appreciate this slide partly because it looked at adults and it asked them the question of, did you experience more anxiety or depression during the COVID-19 pandemic? And the reason why I appreciate this slide is it doesn't matter what your age was, right? Adults ages 18 to 24, 25 to 49, 50 to 80, 64, and 65 plus, every single one continued to say that we saw an increase in depression and anxiety. And so when we think about that, we have just gone through a pandemic. And with that, what are we going to do to better take care of ourselves? Because I do think that one of the reasons that so many of us struggled in the pandemic is we went into it without a lot of capacity to manage that level of stress. And when you think about that in life, do we anticipate another pandemic? Hard to know. Can you anticipate that you're going to go through other big life stressors in the next couple decades? Probably. And so when we think about that, what are we going to do to be able to have more capacity to be able to handle the upcoming stressful events? So how does stress impact us? If you think about this first physically, think about it like your car, okay? Many times when I think about my car, right, the check engine light sometime begins to come on when I'm not taking great care of it, right? And for us physically, we start to see sometimes short-term effects to stress. Sometimes for some of us, it's faster breathing, certainly faster heart rate, dry mouth, nausea, constipation, diarrhea, right? We sometimes start to have some of those short-term kind of physical complaints that our body is telling us, hey, you got a lot of stress going on. But if you're like me, okay, I sometimes ignore my check engine light, right? Because sometimes even seriously, even in my car, when that check engine light comes on, sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I got time to go get this checked out, right? So I keep going. Well, what happens if I continue to keep going? Eventually, I'm going to have bigger effects, right? And eventually, potentially, the car is going to break down. And what this looks like physically as far as long-term effects is sometimes this is where we do start to have high blood pressure, headaches, dizziness, ulcers, rashes. People start complaining of more physical complaints. Many of us, again, begin to look at those things and we say, oh, I'm just going through a stressful time. But yet those physical complaints continue, we continue to ignore, eventually the car will break down. If this doesn't affect us physically, how is stress affecting you emotionally? Okay, and I always think when I do a presentation, I have to pause and talk through the signs and symptoms of depression and anxiety. Because still too much in our world, when I ask somebody what depression is, they'll tell me sadness. When I ask somebody what anxiety is, they'll typically tell me worry. But there's a lot of other symptoms of depression and anxiety that sometimes, again, are sometimes that light coming on saying, hey, I think there's something going on here. When we think of anxiety, we sometimes see people who have that intense fear about something specific or a situation, or sometimes it's more just this generalized anxiety where there's nothing necessarily wrong, but they have just this angst, this kind of feeling of just having discomfort. Sometimes we see difficulty with sleeping. A lot of times with anxiety, we'll see more physical complaints of headaches, stomach aches. A lot of times we'll see more irritability or more anger, and that's true of both depression as well as anxiety. Why do you think that would be? Why, when somebody is struggling with depression or anxiety, why do we begin to see more anger? Absolutely, it's harder to control our emotions when we're in that, right? The other thing is that in our society, anger is actually one of those emotions that's pretty well actually socially acceptable, right? If I come into work on Monday and somebody says, hey, how was your weekend? And I say, oh, I'm so ticked off because my husband did this, it's actually pretty accepted, right? If I come to work on Monday and somebody says, how are you doing? And I say, I am just so anxious about so much going on in life, and I can't even quite describe to you why. That feels pretty different, right? Same thing with depression. If I walk into work on Monday and somebody says, how was your weekend? And I say that, gosh, I've just been so sad. I can hardly even get off the couch. I don't have any energy. That takes a lot more vulnerability than saying, I'm so angry or I'm so ticked off. So a lot of times we actually see people that they're more willing to show us their anger, harder to sometimes show the anxiety or the depression. Other symptoms of depression that we sometimes see is that unable to find enjoyment in things that I once did enjoy. And with this, we sometimes see a lot of shame, right? Because when I'm struggling with depression, right, when that stress continues to elevate to the point that maybe I begin to struggle with depression and I go spend time with my kids and I don't find joy in that, there's sometimes shame, right? Or I go spend time with my grandkids or my friends, or I go play baseball or go play basketball, things that typically I love to do and I don't find joy in that. What's wrong with me, right? But that is a classic symptom of depression. And a lot of times people aren't recognizing it as a symptom of depression. Instead, they're beginning to shame themselves for their own feelings. We see a lot of times a change in eating patterns or a change in sleeping patterns. Some people have hypersomnia where all they want to do is sleep. Some people have insomnia where they struggle to sleep. We see changes in energy. But this change in energy isn't so much, hey, it was a long 3-day holiday weekend and I'm just kind of tired on Tuesday. For some of us, this change in energy is to the point where, again, it's hard to get off the couch. It's hard to even care enough to put on makeup, or certainly hard enough to care enough about going to exercise. We see a lot of times more isolation. Why do you think people isolate when they're depressed? Yeah. Absolutely, they feel numb. They just want to be by themselves. They don't want to associate with other people, right? It is really hard to walk into spaces when you're struggling with depression, right? Are they going to recognize this in me? I hear a lot of patients talk to me about the fact that I don't want to burden them. I don't want to bring them my sadness. And so a lot of times people will isolate. But think about the last time that you spent a lot of time alone. Many times when we spend a lot of time alone and we do isolate, we actually experience more depression, right? We sometimes have more anxious thoughts. And so we get in this pattern where we isolate, we therefore feel more depressed and anxious. We're more depressed and anxious, so we want to isolate more. We isolate more, we feel more depressed and anxious, and we're stuck in this cycle, right? Another classic symptom of depression is difficulty concentrating or paying attention. And what we know, and we've heard this talked about already today, is that when each of this goes untreated, right? If you go back to my car analogy, if you look at depression and anxiety symptoms as the check engine light coming on saying, hey, I think there's something wrong here, many of us will rationalize that all of this is chalked up to, it's just summer, I'm just busy, and we'll disregard it. Sometimes even we might see it in our family members and our friends, and we just say, it does seem like they got a lot going on at work right now. So those check engine light comes on, we ignore it, and this is where we are at risk of people having suicidal thoughts. This is where sometimes people are getting to a point where they don't want to continue to live, and this is why we have to continue to have these conversations, because we can't continue to see those numbers go up. When we look at statistics and we look at the mental health crisis in America, I'm not going to bore you with reading through every one of these statistics, but overall, the data continues to tell a story that we are seeing an increase in mental health conditions and we are seeing an increase in substance abuse. If this need continues, the challenging part of that is it's going to be hard to continue to maintain enough personal supports and professional supports. So my challenge for you is whatever brings you here today, okay? If you are a clinician, if you are somebody who maybe knows somebody who are struggling, if you're just here for information, what I would challenge you is we know that the need continues to be there. And again, we each have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about it to take care of our own mental health? The first thing I'm going to challenge you to do is to educate yourself, and that's why I thank you for having this conversation today. We have to continue to educate ourselves about mental health conditions to be able to better recognize it in others, but also be able to recognize it in ourselves. We have to encourage a culture that acknowledges that it is okay to not be okay. I have now worked in mental health for the last 15 years, and I will tell you that I believe that we have made a lot of stride when it comes to challenging the stigma of mental illness. I think many times now we are able to look at other people with a lot less judgment when we know that they are struggling. Where I believe, however, that we have a lot of growth still needed is it okay that I'm not okay? I think many of us, even those who work in this field, will tell you that they certainly understand depression, they certainly understand anxiety, and they certainly would not judge people who come to them for help. But how many of us, when we're struggling, is it okay that we struggle? Because we, of all people, we teach this stuff, right? We, of all people, should be able to know how to cope with depression and anxiety and life stressors, but we're human, right? And just like providers who treat cancer, oncologists still get cancer, just like people like us who work in this field can still have depression and anxiety. We also need to continue to encourage people to reach out for help, and we really have to acknowledge how hard it is, right? I think too often we make it sound like, hey, if you're struggling, just ask for help. We make it sound like it's as easy as asking for somebody to come help mow your lawn because you had a broken leg. It seems very different when we struggle with mental health. And so not only do I believe that we have to have the conversation, that we have to encourage people to ask for help, let's acknowledge that it's going to feel uncomfortable, right? We make it sound like after you do it, you're all of a sudden going to feel better. If it worked like that, people would ask for help. Instead, many people continue to struggle to ask for help because it is uncomfortable. I have to feel vulnerable. For some of us, we haven't maybe been raised in homes or in settings or in relationships where asking for help was acceptable. Instead, you were supposed to figure it out for yourself. And so now when we begin to ask people, no, you actually don't have to figure it out yourself, go ask for help, I think we have to do a better job of acknowledging, but it's going to be hard. It's going to be uncomfortable. But it's required in order for us to continue to get through this. And then for today, what we're really going to focus on is trying to practice safe, simple self-care. So I want you to pause and just think to yourself, how do you do at practicing self-care at work? 0 would be poor at practicing self-care, and a 10 would be great at practicing self-care. How do you do at practicing self-care at work? 0 is poor, and a 10 is great. Anybody in the room? Would you say that you are a 10? A 9? An 8? We got an 8. All right. So the good news is none of you are a 9 or a 10, so it's good that we're talking about this, right? Let's challenge that to how do you do at practicing self-care at home? A 0 is poor, a 10 is great. How many of you are a 10 at practicing self-care at home? 9, 8. We got an 8. So again, I think the reason you're all here, right, is because practicing self-care both at home as well at work is challenging, okay? When I was doing this presentation a couple months ago, I was talking to my medical director, and he said, hey, what are you gonna go do today? And I said, oh, I'm gonna go to a presentation on self-care. And he paused and he said, you know, Amber, there's that quote out there. If you don't know how to do something, just teach about it instead. And I kind of laughed, but the reality is I empathize with you, right? I talk about self-care all the time. I believe in it. I know why we have to do it. And I too find it hard. So let's talk about why. Why is it hard to practice self-care either at home or at work? What gets in the way? Yeah.
we have someone who said it's very difficult as a mental health professional to take care of your own mental health and physical health. When agencies we work for scold you for missing work in order to do that, I think that it often gets overlooked that employers do not always support your self-care, even if they say they do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate that feedback. And I think it's something that, again, what's hard about practicing some self-care sometimes at work is, does your employer support it? And I think we could also look at that sometimes at home, right? Does your support system support it? Does it encourage it? Thank you for sharing. Why else? Why else is it hard to practice self-care? Why are we not at 10s? Yeah.
I think it's hard for myself is I'm so focused on my clients and my victims that I don't tend to focus on myself sometimes, and then I get burnt out.
Absolutely.
And so then I almost have to like do a reboot. So for me, it's swimming, like that cold shock to get myself back to where I need to go. And so like it's hard for you in that profession. You preach to your clients like you need to do self-care, but then you look at yourself like, oh, maybe I should be giving my own advice to my own self. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's what's hard. Many of us are in the caring profession, right? And so we kind of identify ourselves as caregivers, right? And caregiving feels like I have to be giving to somebody else, not taking, right? We're going to talk about that. Anybody else? What stops you from taking care of yourself either at home or at work?
It seems too big to do every day.
Yeah, seems too big. Absolutely. We're going to talk about that. Yeah. Somebody else have their hand raised? Yeah.
I guess just at home, just like looking around, like all the things I could be doing, and if I am sitting down and relaxing, feeling guilty about the thing I'm not doing.
Absolutely.
So I don't know.
Absolutely, right? When I'm at home, if I stop and take care of myself, who's going to do the laundry, right? Who's going to get the baseball uniform cleaned by the game, right? Who's going to have supper made? So we're going to talk about that, because I do think, and I'm going to go back to what was said earlier as well, about sometimes it feels so big. I think one of the pieces that we have to begin to challenge is, how do we break this down? How do we get it more simple so that it's more attainable? So we're going to talk next just about some of the barriers. Some of them you brought up, and some of them I'm going to bring up for you. So maybe one of your barriers to self-care is how you see self-care. So there's a self-care is selfish mindset, which I always think is interesting, because as it was brought up earlier, we would never say that to a client, right? We would never say that to a patient, that self-care is selfish. But yet, sometimes for ourselves, that is how we begin to see it. So the World Health Organization defines self-care as the ability of individuals, families, and communities to promote health, prevent disease, maintain health, and to cope with illness and disability with or without the support of a healthcare provider. So I think what's interesting about even their definition, right, is it really is to promote, to prevent, to maintain, right? This isn't like we just do it if we have time. When we think about practicing self-care, the Oxford Dictionary defines it as taking action to preserve or improve one's own health. So if you struggle with this if you struggle with this mindset that it's selfish, what I would challenge you is, maybe we have to challenge you to define it the way that it is actually defined, right? The other thing I would challenge is, maybe for you, you have to instead challenge yourself to focus on the benefits. We know that people that practice self-care have a greater capacity to manage stress, reduce symptoms of mental health, maintain positive connections with others, and they're better able to achieve their goals and potential. So broadly, how I sometimes summarize that is thinking about it that by me taking care of myself, I can better take care of others, right? When I think about even my own relationships, whether it be professionally or personally, when I enter that relationship feeling overwhelmed, feeling burned out, they don't get the best version of me. So the more that I can take care of myself, the more that maybe I am able to maintain those positive connections and meet my own goals. Another barrier to self-care, as was talked about, is that caregiver mindset, right? It's more important to help others, and I will be okay. What I would challenge you, okay, you'll notice I like a lot of analogies. What I would challenge you is, think of yourself like the cell phone kiosk, right? When you think of a cell phone kiosk, multiple phones go into the kiosk in order to charge, right? And if you think about yourself like the kiosk, many of us are like that in life. I can speak personally. As my own cell phone kiosk, my husband will come to me and ask him to charge his battery. My kids will come to me and ask them to charge their battery. My friends, I have patients, I have their family members. There are multiple people in my life that come to me to charge my battery. If my kiosk is not plugged into the wall, I am going to be able to charge no one. And for some of us, we believe that we are going to be able to continue to charge everybody even though we're not plugged into the wall, right? So maybe it's, again, trying to challenge that mindset of thinking of it that I have to take care of others. Instead, what I would challenge, in order to take care of others, you have to make sure that you yourself are plugged in. Another barrier sometimes is the superhero mindset. I should be able to cope. And when I think of this one, I would really challenge you that if these are messages that you say to yourself, I would challenge you to think of your best friend and ask yourself, would you say the same thing to your best friend? So if your best friend called you and said, hey, Amber, I got home from work, I had laundry to do, I had supper to make, but I just stopped and I went for a 5-minute walk. Would you say back to that friend, like, how could you? You took 5 minutes for yourself before you took care of your family? We would never talk to our family like, or a friend like that. But yet that's sometimes the message that we say to ourselves. If your child came to you and said, gosh, this week at school has been so stressful. I just think that before I start my homework, I'm gonna go take a bath. I don't think that you would look at your child and say, like, you're weak. You gotta get stronger than that. You would never talk to them like that. But yet those are the messages that we begin to say to ourselves. If you are a person that struggles at work because, again, you feel like either your employer or you feel like your peers feel like you can't pause to take a break, how do you talk to your colleagues? If your colleagues come to you and say, hey, today at work, before I turned on my computer, I stopped and I did some deep breathing, you'd probably tell them, awesome job. But yet, what are the messages that you're telling yourself? So if you're struggling with some of these messages, I really challenge you, try to talk to yourself like you would a friend, or talk to your child or somebody that you care about. Another barrier to self-care that we hear a lot is time. I'm too busy, I gotta get all this other stuff done first. Has anybody in here ever run out of gas? Thank you. I'm glad to know that I am not alone in this. Okay, so I am known in my family, okay? They don't really love this part about me, but I am known that I am a person that from time to time I run out of gas, okay? And this is something that you might think this happened when I was much younger. Now I'm older, I figured it out. Nope, haven't figured it out yet. So there are times that I have run out of gas. And my husband will come with gas. He does not come with grace, I will tell you that. But when he comes, he will typically ask this very important question of, what did you think was going to happen? And it's a very fair question, right? Because I would like to tell you that my car is one that the gas tank doesn't work. Oh no, it works, right? In fact, there's like a message that comes on like the monitor, right? That says like low fuel, and I just push dismiss and I keep on going until I've literally run out of gas, okay? And when I think about it, I think the same thing sometimes happens to us physically and emotionally, right? When you think about some of those signs and symptoms that we talked about either physically or we talk about emotionally, those are sometimes, again, like our fuel lights coming on saying like, hey, I think you're running out of gas. And if you're like me, sometimes it's like, nah, I'm good, right? But then no wonder why all of a sudden I come down with the flu, or I have this cold that I just can't shake. Or emotionally, I'm so overwhelmed that none of my relationships are going well because I'm just so irritable in all of them, right? When we continue to say that we don't want to make time, because that's largely why I do physically run out of gas in my car, is I hate taking time to go get gas. I have like a lot of things I need to get done in the day, and stopping at Casey's takes too much time. And so I don't want to take the time, but the reality is if I don't, my car stops working. And the same thing is true for us. None of us want to take time to take care of ourselves, but if we don't, we will physically or emotionally run out of gas. Another barrier to self-care is competing priorities, right? Some of you talked about this. There's too much to get done. What I would challenge you is consider building in rest as a catalyst for productivity, not a break from it. And research continues to show us this, right? We know that people who pause to take lunch breaks are more productive in the afternoon as compared to those who try to just work through it, right? I would also challenge you to consider pairing a self-care habit with something that you already have to do. So if you're a person that has to commute to and from work, what is a self-care activity that you could do to and from work, right? For me, every day I take the elevator, certainly more than I should as compared I probably should take the stairs, but I don't. But when I take the elevator, that is my time that I say to myself, I am not going to be on my phone. I am not doing emails. I am not sending texts. That is the time that I'm practicing gratitude each day. And it doesn't take me any extra time, but it's something I'm already doing. If you are a person that typically your commute is a time that you spend trying to take care of everybody else's life problems, right? You're on your phone and you're managing everybody's mental health crisis in your personal support group. Could you instead use that time that, no, I'm going to put on a podcast that I enjoy, that fills my cup, that charges my battery, that plugs the kiosk back into the wall, as compared to using that time to try to take care of everybody else and charge everybody else's battery. Maybe a barrier for you for self-care is role modeling. My mentor works 60 hours a week and I need to be like her. What I would challenge you is, number one, we can practice self-care and work hard. It doesn't have to be one or the other. The other thing is to think about is recently I read a study that talked about houses where kids eat vegetables or houses where parents eat more vegetables. Why would that be? Why do kids who live in homes with parents who eat vegetables eat more vegetables? Because it's there. They see it, right? And I think it's interesting because if I told you as a parent, I'll tell you that one of my priorities and one of my hopes for my kids is that they know that it is okay to take care of their mental health, that it is okay to practice self-care. But if they are raised in a home with a mom and a dad who never shows them that that is okay, the likelihood of them doing it dramatically decreases, right? Just like parents who tell their kids eat vegetables, but they're not eating it themselves, the likelihood of their kids beginning to eat, research is telling us, is not going to happen. So what I would challenge you is, again, if you feel like, gosh, I want to be like my role model, challenge that mindset to who are you a role model for and what do you want them to know? Do you want the people at your workplaces to know that it is okay to pause and take care of yourself? Well, then maybe when we start a meeting, we just stop and we do some deep breathing. Maybe before we do a meeting, we pause and we all say something that we're proud of ourselves for. Begin to change the culture. If we want our culture to change, we have to be a part of it in changing that. So next we're gonna pause and just talk about some different ways that we can practice self-care. There's lots of different theories about kind of the number of dimensions of self-care. I personally like very simple messages. And so today we're just gonna talk about different ways that we can practice self-care spiritually, mentally, physically, and emotionally. So I'm gonna ask you to pause. And what I would like you to do is, if you have your phone, I would like you to either text somebody in your life or get out your notes section, and I want you to write down just 3 to 5 things that you're grateful for. If you have a pen or a paper, you can do it on paper, but I want you just to write down things that you are grateful for. Either put it in your notes, send it to somebody if you'd like, or put it on a piece of paper. I'm gonna give you about 15 seconds. Write down things that you are grateful for. All right, what I ask you to do is just to practice gratitude, right? What we know from research is people who practice gratitude, it helps to improve their physical health, improves their sleep, increases their psychological health, increases empathy. Again, I won't read it all to you, you can see it on the slide, but just look at the positive impacts that come from people who practice empathy. And so when you think about self-care, this doesn't have to be big. These can be small things, right? Maybe it's that every night when you get home, before you walk in the front door, you pause and just think about something that you're grateful for in life. Maybe it's something about like every Thursday for you is Thankful Thursday, where you pause and you practice self-care. What it's doing is that it's allowing our brain to take a pause from the stressful events that are happening in our life to instead pausing and focusing on things that are good in our lives that are happening to us. We're going to watch this short video from Brene Brown.
I think the relationship between joy and gratitude was one of the most important things I found in the research. I wasn't expecting it, but what I found, 12 years of research, 11,000 pieces of data, I did not interview in all that time a person who would describe themselves as joyful or describe their lives as joyous, who did not actively practice gratitude. And for me, it was very counterintuitive because I kind of went into the research thinking that the relationship between joy and gratitude was, if you're joyful, then you should be grateful. But it wasn't that way at all. It was really that practicing gratitude invites joy into our lives. And when I say practice, I think this is the part that really changed my life. It changed my family and the way we live every day. When I say practice gratitude, I don't mean kind of like the attitude of gratitude or feeling grateful. I mean practicing gratitude. These folks shared in common a tangible gratitude practice. They either kept gratitude journals. Some of them did interesting things like at 1, 2, 3, 4, like at 12:34 every day, they said something out loud that they were grateful for. They, one of the things that we do, like we say grace at dinner. And so now after grace, we go around and everyone in my family says something they're grateful for. I mean, and what's interesting is when we first started, I have a first grade son, Charlie, and 8th grade daughter, Ellen. And at first I thought, and we've been doing it for a couple of years now, like they're like, oh God, Mom. And there was a little like, this is, are you experimenting on us? There was a little bit of that. But now what's interesting, even after we did it for like a couple of weeks, that on those crazy busy nights where we're trying to like get to soccer and piano and homework, and Steve and I are just like, we say a quick prayer and we start eating, and my kids are like, whoa, what are you grateful for? And it's been extraordinary because not only absolutely does it invite more joy into our house, it also is such a soulful window into what's going on in my kids' lives. So there are some days when my 8th grader will be like, I'm joyful that there's a huge thick wall between my room and my brother's room, something just very, honest. But there are other days she'll say, she had a friend whose mother recently died. And she said, for a month, she would say, I'm just so grateful that y'all are healthy right now. And so not only did it make us all more aware of what we had and more willing to slow down and really be thankful for the joyful moments we had, but it let me know where she was emotionally in her life. And my son is always, I'm grateful for bugs, I'm grateful for frogs, but sometimes he'll say, I'm grateful that you picked me up early, or, I'm grateful that I finally understand adjectives,
So those who have not listened to Brene Brown, of course, she's fabulous in many of the things that she says. But what I really like about what she talks about is, again, these are simple routines, right? But she also talked about the importance of being intentional with this. What I also appreciated, like what she said, is when we talk about maybe that barrier of role modeling and trying to change that to, instead of, again, I have to not practice self-care to be like my role model, to instead, I want to be a role model in somebody's life, such as my kids. This is a beautiful way of beginning to teach them a small way that they can practice self-care. Another thing that we could do from a mental self-care strategy might be just monitoring our social media use. So is it setting time limits, right? In order to be able to have more time to be able to practice self-care in a different way. Is it if you're a person who's really struggling with comparisons, right? They study people and watch them actually on the social media, and what they see is people who do a lot of scrolling are typically doing more comparisons. And so with that, is it looking at, if you're struggling with comparisons, are there groups or are there people that maybe in this phase of life or this space of life right now you need to unfollow? Maybe it's even somebody that you need to unfriend. If, again, it's to the point where when you're doing it, you're feeling more stressed afterwards, maybe your self-care is not adding something to your life, but rather taking something out. Maybe it's looking at setting boundaries. Whenever we think of boundaries, I always challenge people to make sure that it's very realistic. And when I think of boundaries, I also always talk about the importance of them being consistent. So sometimes what happens is that if you have somebody in your life who, again, they're constantly calling you, right? Asking you to kind of be their unpaid therapist, right? And despite, again, you encouraging them to talk to somebody professionally, they're continuing to come to you. Sometimes what we'll tell ourselves is, well, we're going to start setting boundaries. But when we do that, some of us really struggle to do them consistently. And the example I think of a lot is that we live on a farm. We used to have a dog named Bella, and Bella kept on crossing the road, kept on going to the neighbor's house. So we put up an invisible fence. How well do you think it would work for Bella if one day we turned it on, and one day we turned it off, and the next day we turned it on, and the next day we turned it off? Training is probably not going to go very well, right? Because there's not a consistent limit of the dog fence. And sometimes when we start setting boundaries, some of us really struggle with that consistency piece, right? where we tell people that, you know what, I'm really not going to be able to come over this week because I really need to take care of me right now. But then they call for the second day or the third day and we're like, okay, fine, I'll just come over, right? What I would really challenge you is that maybe in your life, in order for you to have more time to take care of yourself, there's boundaries that need to be set. But what I would encourage you is to try to keep them simple so that you're actually able to enforce them, and keep them simple so that you're able to be consistent with them. And then also expect the discomfort, right? Typically when we say yes to people, we get a response of like, you're the best, you're so awesome, I couldn't do life without you. What kind of responses do you usually get when you tell somebody no? You usually don't get that much praise. A lot of times when we say no, actually the response that we typically get is, really? Well, how about next week? And that kind of makes us feel sometimes pretty vulnerable. It sometimes creates some discomfort. So expect that discomfort. Maybe an emotional self-care strategy for you might be deep breathing. And if you're anything like me, when I was younger and people would tell me to take a deep breath, it would typically look like this. And as you can tell, I'm hyperventilating. The other thing that you probably didn't notice is that I love to multitask. So even people who tell me to stop and take a deep breath, while I'm taking a deep breath, I'm typically also still thinking about everything I have to get done the rest of the day. And not surprisingly, I used to be a person that would say that deep breathing is not very effective for me. What I had learned over time, however, is that deep breathing is effective for me, but I had to change how I was doing deep breathing, right? What we know is that physically, it is important to pace our breathing, right? I actually teach a lot of times the 4-7-8 method. Why the 4-7-8 breath method? Because I'm breathing in for 4, I'm holding it for 7, and I'm breathing out for 8. When I am doing that, I am pacing my breath. The second thing that I'm doing is that when I am counting 4, then 7, then 8, I am also challenging myself to tell myself what to think about at that time, right? It's mindful breathing because I'm telling myself to focus on the counting as compared to what I'm stressed about. So I would really encourage you, research actually shows that when we do 3 cycles of 4-7-8 breathing, it can be as effective as some of the quick acting anti-anxiety medication, not the longer acting. Why is that? Because our body is being set physically and psychologically at the same time. So maybe for you, a self-care strategy is that every night before you take off your badge, you pause and you take some deep breaths. Maybe it's that, again, every day when you wake up, before your feet hit the floor, you pause and do some deep breathing. These are small things that if you're saying that you can't practice self-care because of time, these are important things for our mental health, for our physical health that we can do that don't take a lot of time. Another self-care strategy that we can do is maybe just focus on physical health. Maybe it's looking at our nutrition, our exercise, and your sleep. And what I would really challenge you is to consider treating your body, and I'm not great at this, okay? But treating your body like you would encourage your child to treat their body. So I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. If I told you that how I parent is I tell my 7-year-old, stay up as late as you want, just take an extra energy drink in the morning if you need to. If you get tired by 2 o'clock or so, just go get a latte. If you didn't get much sleep during the week, not a big deal, just get more sleep on Sunday. It all sounds pretty ridiculous. It all sounds like pretty poor parenting. But yet, how do we parent ourselves, right? We look at like, we would never want that for a child, but I'll tell you, myself, look at me the last week. That is sometimes how I parent my own body. So maybe a way for you to practice self-care is just literally thinking about just what's one small piece that I can do in that. Is it just trying to prioritize sleep? Is it trying to prioritize what's going into your body? Maybe a spiritual self-care for you might be looking at journaling or meditating. Maybe it's pausing and taking time in nature, finding belonging in community. Again, overall, there's lots of different ways that we can practice self-care, but the key piece that I would say is really looking at prioritizing this. We need to be realistic about prioritizing, and not everything can be a top priority, right? I sometimes do this even in my own task list, that when I look at like, hey, when am I gonna get this done? Like, there's no way in heck that I'm gonna get that all done this week. But yet that's sometimes what I tell myself, so then when I don't do it, I'm disappointed. Maybe we have to look at how can we better prioritize realistically for ourselves. Maybe it's doing just a self-care ritual, pausing and taking 3 deep breaths, telling themselves something positive, and smiling. I'll tell you that I do this presentation for new nurses at Avera. And it is so sad because because they're students, I can kind of make them do things that are sometimes a little more uncomfortable. And I will ask them to tell me something that they're proud of themselves for, to tell me something that a positive affirmation. And it is so sad how uncomfortable it is for people. Like, it is super hard to sometimes just say, I am proud because I graduated nursing school. I'm proud because I'm doing the very best I can as a mom. That is sometimes super hard for people. And I imagine for some people in this room, it would be equally as awkward. I promise you I won't make you do it. But I will challenge you, sometimes doing something small like that is such an important message for our brains. Maybe it's just pausing and being willing to ask for help. That might be personally, or it might be professionally. Overall, I don't need to tell you how to practice self-care. Really, my goal of today is really to remind you why it's important and to begin to challenge what you might see as barriers. So when we look at next steps, I love this quote. It says, I'm learning how to relax, doctor, but I want to relax better and faster. I want to be on the cutting edge of relaxation. And that's sometimes how we look at this stuff, right? When we look at self-care, it's like, okay, I heard about it. Now I got to go do it big. When we try to do it big, we typically don't get very far. I will remind you, I use the analogy a lot of a ladder, okay? If right now in this room or where you're at, you're really not doing well at self-care. If you tell yourself that what you're gonna do is you're gonna start exercising, even though you haven't done it the last 365 days, you're gonna start doing it 5 to 7 days a week. That's kind of like if you think about using a ladder. How many of you, when you use a ladder, start at the bottom and jump to the top? We don't, right? Because you will fall off. But yet sometimes when some of us start setting goals, like things for self-care, we try to do it so big that we're gonna try to jump to the top of the ladder and then wonder why we fell off, and then we'll tell ourselves awful messages about ourselves. What I would challenge you is instead, keep in mind, this is a process. Maybe one thing that you can do is consider just putting self-care in your schedule, right? If you are a person that follows a planner or you follow a calendar online, the nice thing about putting it into our calendar is that it requires us to intentionally take it out to replace it with something else. If I put in there that every Monday morning at 8 o'clock, I'm gonna pause for 15 minutes and just do deep breathing and focus on gratitude, if somebody calls and says, hey, can you do the pickup for kids this Monday? I have to intentionally say, I am not taking care of myself right now. I'm gonna take that out and I'm gonna take care of these other people. And sometimes that at least sends a message to ourselves that if we're gonna do it, okay, but we're gonna be intentional about it versus it just passively begin to happen. So we just have a couple of minutes. I'm gonna give you just a couple minutes here to pause. And what I would like you to think about is, what is one goal that you can set for yourself today? I'd like you, if you're willing, to either write it down, put it in your notes section, or potentially consider sending it to somebody who would maybe hold you accountable to this. But when you think of self-care, what is one small thing that you can begin to put in your routine? I'm really going to challenge you to consider to do that right now, to think about what is that you're going to begin. I'll give you 2 minutes. All right, thank you for doing that. What I would also challenge you, okay, is that sometimes what happens is after we set these goals, it sounds great right now, but then it's harder once we leave these spaces and now people are, if we're going to need especially help in order to be able to accomplish this. What I would really challenge you is continue to remember your why. And if you need to, please write those down as well. What are 2 reasons why you think it's important to do this? Because sometimes that why is what we really have to remember, especially on days where this gets harder. Is my why because I want my sons to know that it's okay to take care of themselves? Is my why because I want to sustain in the role that I'm doing? Is my why because my relationships are struggling and I want to bring more contentment and peace to relationships versus irritability right now? So if needed, please either write down those whys or at least just pause and help to understand your why. I'm going to end today with just a reason why I think that the why is important. So the person on the screen up there is my uncle. And my uncle about 3 years ago began to struggle with depression. And when he started his struggle, he was somebody that, per what is written on paper, you would not have expected it. He was an accountant. He was a family person. He loved life. He loved sports. He loved everything with family and friends. And he began to struggle with depression. And when I think about him, I actually think a lot of times about that analogy, that I think his check engine light had gone on multiple times and he had ignored it to a point where he began to struggle with really severe depression. And the day before he passed away, so he struggled for about 6 months, and him and I talked almost daily, a lot of times during that time. And the day before he passed away, him and I were working a lot on self-care. And the day before he passed away, I asked him to think about what was something that he was going to do that day to take care of himself. What was he going to do to practice self-care? And then I called him again about 10 hours later and checked in to see how things were going. And I said, so what did you do to practice self-care? And he said, I emptied the dishwasher. And it struck me in that moment, he didn't know how to practice self-care. Even though we make it sound like this stuff is super simple, too often we tell ourselves that we're going to begin to do it, unfortunately, sometimes where it's too hard to be able to learn. And so he was at a space that's similar from a physical standpoint. It's like sometimes when people, again, say that they're going to start taking care of their body or start taking care of their health after they've had a heart attack, you don't always know that you have more time. And he didn't. He died the next day by suicide. And so the piece that I want to remind you is this quote up here. It says, self-care is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And so when you think about self-care, it is not that we talk about this because it is trendy. We have to talk about this because we have to prioritize ourselves and we have to prioritize our mental health. With that, if you have any questions, we do this presentation quite frequently to different organizations. If this is a space that you think this conversation would be important, please reach out. My email is up there. You can certainly contact Navigation. We're a part of that Navigation team at Avera. We partner a lot with the helpline, the presentation right before, and the helpline is amazing at helping us to navigate the state. Sometimes what's hard is sometimes even navigating like Avera within the system. You can certainly always reach out, anybody can, to bhsnavigator@avera.org, and we can help to support you in that. With that, I thank you for listening and for all that you do.
I don't have a lot of time for questions, but we have a break if anybody does have any questions. If Amber, you're willing to take a couple minutes. Yeah, do we have any questions from the audience? Right. Well, if you do, Amber's email is in the Whova chat for any follow-up questions. Our next session will start at 3:15. Thank you.